All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Kyle Ansloan Show. And returning today is Dave DeCamp, news editor of antiwar.com, the host of Anti-War News with Dave DeCamp. Dave, welcome back to the show. How you doing today?
I'm good, Kyle. Thanks for having me back.
So, Dave, I got a lot I want to talk to you about today. Annexation, Graham versus Marjorie Taylor Greene, Trump's new deadline for Russia, and I wonder your thoughts on what Trump's going to do next in Ukraine. So let's start off here with annexation. I have this article that you recently wrote for antiwar.com, Netanyahu to propose U.S. supported plan for annexing Gaza. Dave, I wonder if you could give me like the broad outlines of what Netanyahu is talking about doing here, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, so according to this report, and we've seen other reports now in U.S. and Israeli media, Netanyahu is going to give Hamas an ultimatum, essentially accept our ceasefire proposal, which we don't really know what the details are of what this proposal is. That's part of this ultimatum. Essentially accept this proposal, or we're going to start annexing parts of Gaza. And it says that they would start with what they call the buffer zone, this area around the border where they cut in and demolished everything. They would start there, and then in areas of northern Gaza, and with the goal of eventually annexing the entire territory. And these reports say that this plan has the green light from the Trump administration, and we've seen Trump and some of his other officials, hinting after the ceasefire talks broke down and the U.S. and Israel essentially quit the ceasefire talks with Hamas, have been kind of hinting that some big escalation might be coming. Trump saying that they have to finish the job, and so it seems like amid the starvation that's happening in Gaza, people are now starving to death every day. The world is outraged by it, but it doesn't seem like it's deterring Netanyahu or Trump, and they're just ready to escalate. Now, Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, today had an article saying, is this, are they really going to annex this, or is this part of the negotiations? Are they just trying to pressure Hamas? Because one aspect of this is that it says Netanyahu is doing this to placate Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, who is very unhappy over Israel's recent steps to include, to bring a little more aid into Gaza. Amid this outrage over the starvation, which it's nothing to the level that is needed to avert catastrophe in Gaza. But Smotrich isn't happy. He wants them all to starve to death. And so these reports say that Netanyahu is proposing this annexation plan as a way to placate Smotrich so he stays in the government. So that is another aspect. So is this for real? Are they really going to do this? Or is this a negotiating tactic? I don't know. I lean more toward that Netanyahu might see this as his only shot. And, with everything that's been happening, with the world opinion, with the opinion inside the U.S. turning against him and Israel, I think he might see this as, his last opportunity to grab some land, both in Gaza and the West Bank, and still have the U.S. completely on his side.
Yeah, I mean, good analysis there, Dave. Now, I did want to ask you about what annexation actually looks like inside of Gaza. So, and what does it look like? Trump will say finish the job, and this sounds like big, tough rhetoric. But what does that actually mean for the Palestinians? Where are these people going to go?
Well, that's the thing. Can they even really pull this off? But the plan, as I said, it starts off with annexing these areas where they've completely destroyed everything, where there's no Palestinians. So I wouldn't be surprised, that if they annex that territory, just declare it a part of Israel. And what that would mean is that they're not giving it up, that it's not going back to the Palestinians. So, I really think part of this is that it would be a kind of a symbolic thing to say, okay, negotiations are done. This is just going to continue for however long it takes for us to either, drive everybody out, complete the ethnic cleansing that they want to do, or kill everybody and make it, they're just going to continue making life as miserable as possible for the Palestinians in Gaza. what would it actually look like? Would we see Jewish settlers start moving in? Maybe in some of the border areas, that's possible. But like you said, there's still a lot of Palestinians in Gaza, and they don't want to leave. So what then would Israel do? Will they escalate things? I mean, they're killing 100 Palestinians every single day. That's about been the death toll. Some days it's gone down to like 80, but for the most part, between like 80 and 110 over the past few weeks, every single day. I mean, are they going to escalate more than that? I don't know.
Well, so Dave, I've heard this plan stated several times now that they're going to deport the Palestinians to third countries, and they are, I think, trying to pick like Muslim countries. And this is, been discussed since what, November or October even of 2023. I've heard like Chad, Sudan, Somalia, Puntland, Somaliland, uh,
Libya.
Ethiopia, Libya, Syria, just every war torn country on the planet as potential destinations for the Palestinians. And so, do you think that they're serious about this? That they are going to go down this road? And I mean, what exactly would the U.S. have to do to get, say, Libya to take in 100,000 or 200,000 Palestinians?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're serious in that they want to do it. I think it's clear that's what Israel wants. That's what certain factions of the Trump administration want. I think that's clear. The question is, can they actually pull it off? I mean, the head of Mossad was just in D.C. recently talking about this. And, I've seen reports say that Trump was all about this, moving the Palestinians out for a while. And then apparently, because of all the pushback from the Arab countries in the region, he kind of cooled on it. But there are ways I would think. I mean, this is a lot of people we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
They would have to bribe these countries, and you talk about Libya. You have like Haftar, the warlord who controls part of Libya, who wants kind of, you probably would want some U.S. support. Maybe somebody like him could be convinced to take a few 100,000. Um, but it's really just hard to imagine what country would really be willing to facilitate this ethnic cleansing. Yeah, it's tough to say.
Yeah, well, one of the, I guess, disturbing parts about this is they seem to like maybe be floating it out to enough countries that everybody is shouldering such a little part of the burden that they don't see it as being like, oh, we're not facilitating the genocide, we just took these 100,000 desperate Palestinians, and everybody could kind of say something like that. Now, and also, I don't want to skip over the situation in the West Bank, which happens so often, where Israel is also talking about annexation there too. And I remember, Dave, when the Israeli government, the current Israeli government, first formed in December of 2022, Bezalel Smotrich was very open about the reason he joined the Netanyahu coalition was for this. It wasn't Gaza that they had their eyes on, it was the West Bank. And so you wrote this at antiwar.com. Israeli Knesset passes non-binding resolution calling for the annexation of the West Bank. And I'm just curious, you say this is a non-binding resolution, but it does seem like there's quite a few people in Netanyahu's administration who are really wanting to annex the West Bank.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that they do. And one of the threats that we're seeing from them is, you see France and the UK and other countries talking about recognizing a Palestinian state. One of their
Yep.
threats is, oh yeah, well, we'll annex the West Bank if you do that. And then the question is, again, similar to what you asked about Gaza, like what would that actually look like? And I could see them annexing parts where there's a lot of settlements, maybe the Jordan Valley. These were like the territories that were allotted to Israel in this. If you remember the Trump peace plan from 2020, which essentially was a two-state solution, but the state the Palestinians had basically looked like Swiss cheese the way it was cut up. With the settlements, all the settlements would have stayed intact. So it wasn't a real, proposal. But maybe are they going to just annex some of that territory? Because if they annex the whole territory, then what of the Palestinians? They don't want to give them Israeli citizenship because that means that the voting bloc will be about 50% Arab, 50% Jewish, and they don't want that. They need the majority.
Right.
So, and where are they going to go? I mean, but they, in some places in the West Bank, in the refugee camps in the northern parts, in Jenin, the Jenin refugee camp, the Nur Shams refugee camp, the Tulkarm refugee camp, these are Palestinians or descendants of Palestinians who previously been ethnically cleansed by Israel, and they've completely destroyed these refugee camps and driven out like 40,000 people. So they have begun like mass displacements in the West Bank. It's just getting a lot less attention because it is on a smaller scale than what's happening in Gaza. But they certainly, the West, as you said, the West Bank is like the big prize for these guys, for Smotrich and Ben Gvir and Netanyahu, of course, too.
Right. I mean, Smotrich is a settler himself, right? So annexing the West Bank would make where his home is a part of Israel. That's obviously a big concern of his. Now, Dave, I want to move on and talk about Lindsey Graham and Marjorie Taylor Greene and kind of how the Republican Party is responding to this. Let's first play this clip of Lindsey Graham.
I think Israel's come to conclude that they can't achieve a goal of ending the war with Hamas that would be satisfactory to the safety of Israel, and if they're going to do in Gaza what we did in Tokyo and Berlin, take the place by force, then start over again, presenting a better future for the Palestinians, hopefully having the Arabs take over the West Bank and Gaza. But I think going forward, Christian, you're going to see a change in tactics, a full military effort by Israel to take Gaza down like we did in Tokyo and Berlin.
So, Dave, what do you make of this absolute lunatic monster saying that, we need to treat Gaza like they treated the cities during World War II?
Well, I mean, they already are, they
Right.
already have treated Gaza like that. But I do think, what he's saying, unfortunately, I think that's probably what the people closest to Trump on this are saying as well. And, when we see Trump say it's time to finish the job, it seems like the narrative is that, we tried negotiations, that hasn't worked. Now it's time to really escalate things. And, so I don't think Lindsey Graham, as hawkish and nuts as he is, when I think it comes to Gaza, I mean, I don't think he's really far off base from what Trump is thinking, and certainly not far off base from what the Israeli government is thinking. But just to be saying these things when you see these kids starving to death and everything, it's really monstrous stuff.
Yeah. Well, apparently, Republican congressman was even too monstrous for AIPAC. Randy Fine, who is maybe the worst member of Congress that we've ever had, says was taken off the list of Republicans that are endorsed by AIPAC. So, Dave, what do you think about this?
Yeah, well, what's funny is that AIPAC has actually clarified. They didn't exactly deny he was removed from the list, but they put out some statements saying, "Oh, because he was just elected, we're going to consider his endorsement later in the election cycle." So they're kind of denying that it's like a big deal, but it is kind of crazy that they're essentially saying, "Oh, we're not dropping this guy just because he told Palestinians to starve away." But the timing here, they removed them from the list right after that tweet. In response to the news of Palestinians starving to death, he said, "Release the hostages. Until then, starve away." And I mean, that's just as monstrous as you can get, especially when it's, who's starving away? Is it Hamas that's starving away? And it's children and elderly people and the most vulnerable people in Gaza. So yeah, I mean, he is just. I think they're not supposed to say it. They're in the denial phase right now. You see most of the Israel supporters and propagandists somehow denying that there's hunger in Gaza. Even Netanyahu saying that.
Right.
You're not supposed to say starve away.
Yeah, I almost as like an American Itmar Ben Gvir or something who will actually say that we should bomb the aid facilities, the food storage, and things like that, where any decent person is going to I mean, maybe assume that you're joking, that nobody really is that evil. Like, there were evil people like that in history, but come on, today, like, somebody's actually going to bomb food in the midst of a epic malnutrition crisis for children. Like, nobody's really that monstrous. And yet, Randy Fine, Ben Gavir, Smotrich, and Lindsey Graham, even Donald Trump, all just routinely kind of double down on this absolutely horrific policy that is making so many people absolutely disgusted. And interestingly enough, Dave, you have those two members of Congress who are a part of the Republican Party, but you also have Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is certainly the most outspoken Republican, but over the past couple of weeks, maybe the most outspoken member of Congress against providing U.S. aid to Israel and criticizing what Israel is doing in Gaza, referring to it as a genocide. I think she says she unequivocally condemned it in another tweet. I mean, this isn't just like one single post or one speech. She's taking this to her Twitter account. She called Israel a nuclear state on Steve Bannon's show. So what do you make of Marjorie Taylor Greene suddenly being really good on this issue, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, she's breaking a lot of taboos, describing Israel as a nuclear armed state, now saying that it's committing genocide. She led that amendment to cut $500 million in military aid to Israel. It's really interesting to see. She's considered, a pretty right-wing member of Congress. So I think it's good. I think it opens up the conversation on that side of the aisle a lot. And we see, this happening with like media figures, especially Tucker Carlson. I mean, I just saw he had Mearsheimer on his show, John Mearsheimer, and the title is like, Israel's committing genocide in Gaza or something like that. So this stuff is really breaking through kind of in the U.S., and now we're starting to see it from a member of Congress, one that is more kind of in tune with what the people are thinking. She's more populist and doesn't have a lot of big donors. I saw someone sharing information about her, how she raises money. She has a lot of very small to medium sized donors who support her. I think it's clear that, you see Thomas Massie as well. People are very supportive of him, and he's on the right side of this issue. So I think maybe it's become clear to her that it's a popular position for her to be taking.
Yeah, I guess, one of the things you got to like about Marjorie Taylor Greene at times is when she does sink her teeth into an issue, she's typically not just trying to be a part of the political moment. She really takes a hold of it and really tries to like further whatever cause she's going after. So she is bringing up and trying to cut military aid for Israel on the floor of Congress. I mean, I think this is quite important, actually. And she's not a congresswoman that I always or even usually agree with, but certainly her willingness to break with Trump has been a very pleasant surprise, over the last 6 months. Now, Dave, as much as we could talk about Gaza and how horrific that is for a while, I do want to get your thoughts on what's happening with the war in Ukraine. Trump recently made this really absurd statement when he was at a press conference with the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer in Scotland.
In all sense, your frustration with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
Do you think he's been lying to you about his intentions in Ukraine?
Well, I don't want to use the word lying. All I know is we'd have a good talk, and it seemed on, let's say, 3 occasions, it seemed that we were going to have a ceasefire and maybe peace, and you divide it up and you do whatever you have to do, that obviously to get to the end. And all of a sudden, missiles are flying into Kiev and other places. And I say, what's that all about? I spoke to him 3-4 hours ago, and it looked like we were on our way, and then I'd say, forget it, and I'm not going to talk anymore. This has happened on too many occasions, and I don't like it. I don't like it.
So, have you had any other radio channels conversations with the Russians reiterating this?
In what?
Reiterating this new pressure and deadline.
Yeah, we're going to have well, you're the press. I'm reiterating it to you. I'd say 10 to 12 days. I'll announce it probably tonight or tomorrow. But there's no reason to wait. if you know what the answer is going to be, why wait? And it would be sanctions and maybe tariffs, secondary tariffs. You know what a secondary tariff is. And look, the Russian economy, I don't want to do that to Russia. I love the Russian people. They're great people. I don't want to do that to Russia. But this thing, they're losing a lot of Russians. They've lost 1 million Russians. And that's the, sons. That's the sons and daughters of Russian families. They leave the house, they go, bye mom, bye dad, and then they get blown away. And Ukrainian too. Look at Ukraine. It's a disaster what's happened there. But it continues to go on. As you know, we made a deal where the European Union is essentially involved, but it's NATO, and we're supplying weapons to NATO. NATO's now paying.
So, Dave, I mean, that was just a wild, rambling statement. And you can almost imagine if Biden said it, the White House would just walk it back later and be like, the president really didn't mean that. But how the hell is he going to just arbitrarily set a 10 to 12 day deadline for the Russians to end this war? I mean, what is going on here, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with Trump is it's tough to really know if any of this means anything. But one kind of interesting piece of news today was that Trump announced 25% tariffs on India and also some other unspecified penalty. And he said that these steps were being taken both because of India's own tariffs and trade barriers, but also because of India's trade with Russia, because they're buying Russian oil and because they buy Russian military equipment. So when he talks about secondary tariffs, that's what he's talking about, is putting big tariffs on Russia's, main trading partners, which include India and also China. And we have this big bill in the Senate for 500% tariffs, which is kind of absurd. But Trump's thrown out this 100% number, so we don't really know what he's actually going to do. But it's either what I really think it's going to be, I mean, is kind of similar to what he announced on India today. Nothing really that substantial, but, it's action that he's taking over this war that there's just no interest for the U.S. for this thing to continue. And he's going about it in just a completely wrong way. I mean, I would say that Russia would almost want the U.S. to put more sanctions on India and China, because it would make those countries more reliant on Russia, increase their trade relationship. Somehow he thinks this is going to change things. I mean, this is the Biden doctrine. You're getting more weapons to Ukraine and sanctions and now tariffs. There's just no reason to think that this is going to have any kind of impact on Russia's thinking. I mean, it's kind of, not at all. So I don't really take the threats that seriously. I mean, again, I just don't see them doing they're not going to put 500% tariffs on China and India. It's just absurd.
So, Dave, as absurd as it is, I guess one of the reasons I am a little bit concerned about it is I remember early in the war, there were reports from the White House basically saying that they were putting stricter sanctions on Russia than they even wanted to, or they thought would be good for Western economies, because they had gone so far over the top on the propaganda about Putin being the new Hitler that you got to do something about Hitler. And so, if you're not, and they were using, the price caps on Russian oil, they were referring to as, the equivalent of an economic nuclear weapon. I mean, we've seen some real lunacy when it comes to sanctions. And I think you identify a really important point there, which is either these sanctions are not sanctions, I guess, in this case, tariffs are going to be so small that they don't, discourage these companies and countries from doing business with Russia, or they're going to be so significant that it's going to empower and make Brits in the Shanghai Cooperation effectively replace the IMF and SWIFT-backed American system that uses the dollar. And as you said, that would strengthen Russia. And so what kind of mess has Trump gotten himself into here?
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like, he has the attitude now that he's got to do something as long as the war goes on. And I mean, realistically, this war is not ending. what it would take for Trump to actually end the war would be to cut off the military aid to Ukraine and make them agree to a deal, essentially sign the terms of surrender. I think there was actually a good opportunity to do that at the beginning of the Trump administration, and Ukraine probably could have gotten the best terms it was going to get at that point. Russia has been very clear that it's not going to give up on the territory, but the fact is Trump should have bitten that bullet in the beginning, because now, as long as this thing goes on, Ukraine's just going to lose more and more. And because Trump or Zelensky don't want to be the ones to make that move to surrender, it's going to happen eventually, years down the line, and it's going to be just a complete defeat, more so than it would be now. But at this point, I just don't see Trump reversing this. It just seems like, this war is just going to go on. And Russia, I do think the risk of it escalating into a war between the U.S. and Russia, NATO and Russia, has gone down a bit. At the same time, of course, we see these reports about Trump considering sending long-range weapons, asking about if they could hit Moscow, and all the European leaders kind of frantically planning for war with Russia, claiming that Russia is going to invade Eastern Europe in a few years. So that stuff isn't good. But I think there is a chance that this just kind of drags out for years and years until finally someone says, all right, let's just give it up.
Well, Dave, I guess this is, perfect of where I want to go with the next question, which is, what does Donald Trump do next? Because Ukraine needs weapons, right? Like the war doesn't continue to go on if America pulls all of its support from Kiev. And while Trump could probably keep up with the intelligence assistance and some of the training and other military assistance without further funds from Congress, there's certainly a limit on how much money the NATO countries could pull together and are willing to spend on Ukraine. And so I would guess, Dave, that means eventually, and not too far down the road, Trump is going to need money to continue this war. So I guess two questions. One is, can you just kind of update the audience on if Trump decided to send more weapons to Ukraine now, does he have any funding to do that? And number two, do you think Trump goes back to Congress when he runs out of funding?
Yeah, I believe he has a few billion in the presidential drawdown authority that he could potentially use to send weapons there. And then there's kind of a few $100 million that's in the, annual NDAA, the military spending bill. And there are ways I think they could finagle things and send weapons to Ukraine using little tricks with the budget. But how far could that really go? Probably not very far. So, but I would say if he is going to go to Congress for money, we would probably see that happen next year. I think they can get away with what they have left and kind of encouraging the NATO countries and the EU to start buying more stuff. If they really go along with this plan, they could get through this year. But yeah, if this war is still going on and in 2026, I think he probably will have to go to Congress. And then, of course, that'll just go against everything Trump and the MAGA movement and the Republicans in Congress who have been against this war campaigned on essentially last year. So, that would be kind of a big hit to Trump.
Putin, your turn is coming. Donald Trump is the Scotty Scheffler of American politics.
Lindsey Graham had a word there.
Yeah, Lindsey Graham hopped in. Before we wrap up here, Dave, I do want to remind people to share the show. We have over 1,700 people, just shy of 2,000 right now watching us on X. So if you are on X, share out the show. Help us get to that 2,000 mark. And of course, subscribe to the YouTube channel. That way you could catch all the future episodes. If you're in the chat, let us know what you think. And of course, Dave, I always appreciate your time. Now, before we wrap, I did want to ask you one last question, which was, money aside, there seems to be maybe a separate issues here, which is, how long can the Ukrainians keep? Do they have the manpower to keep fighting? And then, logistically, does the West have the weapons? Can we produce weapons fast enough to send to the Ukrainians, when at the same time, of course, we are also tied up in the Middle East and wanting to engage in this massive military buildup in East Asia as well. But, particularly with the interceptors, it seems that we're going to come to a time, and that is going to be sometime soon, where how are they going to shoot down the Russian missiles when they don't have Patriots, when Raytheon is only making 500 of those a year? And, we're using hundreds of them to defend Israel as well. I mean, do you see like this similar situation where even if they have the money, they simply just may run out of the weapons and manpower?
Yeah, I mean, I think the manpower is probably a bigger factor there than the weapons because, it's tough to really know. But, if based on what the Russian Defense Ministry says, I mean, they claim that there's like 1,000 Ukrainian casualties that's dead and wounded every day. Now, I don't know if that number is accurate, but it is clear that the fighting along the front line is heavy and there's a lot of casualties. But I really just have no sense of how long they can keep fighting manpower wise. When it comes to the weapons, I mean, I think that this is becoming a big problem for the U.S., especially because they use all sorts of weapons in the Middle East. But there have been, starting under Biden in 2022 and 2023, they've taken all these companies got huge contracts from the Pentagon to increase production of all these things. Now, it's nothing on the level that Russia is doing because Russia is directly in a real war and in a wartime economy, and they're on a war footing, a lot more than the U.S. and NATO. But there has been steps in the U.S. and in Europe to increase the production of things. So I think they could keep this war going if they want. But the U.S. is certainly getting outstretched, and there are China hawks in the Trump administration that do not want the U.S. expending all these munitions in the Middle East and on sending them to Ukraine. So there could be a point where they decide to tighten the belt, and they decide to make a decision, that it is time to end the war. That could be a factor that eventually ends it.
Right. Or I guess if Netanyahu starts a real war with Iran, we will, I think Zelensky will very quickly find out that Ukraine is below Israel in the pecking order of the U.S. empire and who gets weapons first. Well, Dave, thank you so much for returning to the show today. I will let you get going. I know you have a bunch of articles to write. Everybody, check out Dave's work at antiwar.com. He is the news editor there, and every day just cranking out tons of articles, giving you all the global news that you need, all the happenings in the U.S. empire, with all the U.S. propaganda stripped out of it. So thanks so much for your time today, Dave.
Thanks, Kyle.